So welcome everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you both in person and online to tonight's inaugural lecture given by Simon Green, who joined us here at the University of Salford last December as our new Pro Vice Chancellor Research and Knowledge Exchange and Professor of Politics. I know Simon's wife and children and his mother and some other people who unfortunately couldn't be here. His children have a really good excuse, exams tomorrow. They're joining us online, so I'm sure that you're going to be very much with us here tonight. So let me tell you a little bit about Simon. Simon's originally from Northwest Germany. He began his academic career on the other side of the city at the University of Manchester. And it's nice to see a colleague of Manchester here as well, where he read European Studies and German. His degree included a semester in political science at the University of Heidelberg, as well as a placement at BMW corporate headquarters in Munich. And it was at Heidelberg and Manchester that his interest in the politics of modern Germany was kindled, not surprising given his background. So after graduation, Simon received a PhD scholarship from the newly established Institute for German Studies at the University of Birmingham. Funded by the German Academic Exchange Service in the aftermath of German unification, this was a unique experiment in UK higher education, which quickly punched above its weight. It was led by William Patterson and Charlie Jeffrey, who also supervised Simon's PhD on immigration and citizenship policy in Germany. Simon's first academic appointment was at the University of Portsmouth, which he describes as a brilliant place to learn and to teach students, to learn to teach students. Slight difference. In 2000, he returned to the Midlands to take up a lectureship at the Institute for German Studies. He was promoted to senior lecturer and deputy director of the Institute in 2006. During this time, he began to broaden his research out towards comparative immigration policy and also towards the changing structures of governance in United Germany. In 2008, he was appointed to a personal chair at Aston University and was in 2016 awarded a 50th anniversary professorship. Here, he established the Aston Centre for Europe and put in place a growth strategy which saw the Department of Politics and International Relations grow from 6 staff then to 25 today. He became head of department, deputy dean of the School of Languages and Social Sciences, and then Pro Vice Chancellor and Executive Dean of his school. In 2018, he switched roles to become Pro Vice Chancellor Research, a position he held until shortly before he left Aston to join us at Salford. Simon served on the Area Studies panel for both REF 2014 and 2021 and was elected Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in 2011. He also continued to research, including a project on the changing nature of Christian democracy in Germany, and he co-authored an undergraduate textbook on German politics. I know that he enjoyed immensely working on both, although he did confess to me that writing a textbook is much harder than it looks. For almost 10 years now, he's been providing regular commentary on British politics to the morning show on BBC Hereford and Worcester, a great example of knowledge exchange in action. So for Simon's mother, I want to say one sentence in German. Sie sollten sehr stolz auf ihren Sohn sein, which means you should be very proud of your son. So tonight, Simon will be drawing on his research of over 30 years, not 20, 30 years, to talk to us about the state of Germany in both senses of the phrase. Given the rise of populist and extreme right-wing parties across Europe, including in my own home country of the Netherlands, this is a very important topic for us. Simon has a fondness for references to pop culture, which is reflected in his title tonight. So without further ado, let me now invite you, Simon, to present your inaugural lecture at the University of Salford, Under Pressure, ? Democracy in Contemporary Germany.
Thank you so much, Simone, for these very kind and generous words of introduction, and good evening to you all here tonight. It's delighted that you've all joined me here today for this talk. Today is in fact the 1-year anniversary of my interview for this job that I'm currently holding. So it seems actually quite therefore an apposite opportunity here to talk a little bit about democracy in contemporary Germany. I'm also really thrilled that actually so many people have joined online, including most importantly my mother. Hallo Tinzi, schön dass du da bist. And of course my family who are in Birmingham and elsewhere, including my uncle, hello, lieber Uncle Theodor, in Sweden, who's been able to join us tonight, as well as various other friends. So it's great to have you all here today and joining this. So I want to talk a bit about democracy in contemporary Germany. And just in case there's any doubt where Germany is, that is the map of Germany. And what I want to do today really is to talk about some of that kind of background and take a long approach to what's been going on in Germany. We all know that Germany is the most populous nation in the European Union, that it's the largest economy in the EU, obviously, and the third largest globally, and it's the world's third largest exporting nation. You don't need me to tell you about Germany's turbulent history, particularly in the last century, but of course also that there was an attempt at democracy between the two world wars, which tragically failed. But interestingly, of course, today Germany is a successful and a stable cornerstone of liberal democracy globally. It's one of the really the poster boys, if you like, the shining examples of actually where a country which had a very difficult and disastrous totalitarian history has actually become a stable democracy. The constitution, the basic law, the Grundgesetz, turned 75 in 2024 and is now the most long-lived in German history. So what I want to do is look at those three principal questions. So firstly, what's the secret source of German democracy post 1945? But then secondly, look at how Germany has changed after unification in 1990, and then to identify some structural challenges for Germany in the future. And because I do think that 3 is in fact a magic number, you'll see that there's lots of 3s in all of this going through. So effectively there's nine separate little sections as we go through this, which I'll try to do reasonably quickly before we come up to, once again, 3 themes of modern Germany. Okay, so let's start off by thinking about what those foundations of West German democracy are. And the first one is actually that role of history, what Manfred Schmidt has referred to as the learning from catastrophes, the legacy of National Socialism. And of course, you have to start off by thinking about the Grundgesetz, the basic law, because that is fundamental to this. It is, as I mentioned already, a very successful document. But one of the reasons is there are a number of reasons why it's successful. It has a list of fundamental rights. It's different to a kind of human rights charter, but it has a list of fundamental rights which cannot be amended in their essence. They can be tweaked, but they cannot be amended fundamentally in their essence. That's quite an unusual item in constitutional law, and I think is an important part of actually guaranteeing that German democracy was going to be successful. But it also, beyond that, has a deliberately and self-consciously semi-sovereign political system. This is a term coined by the German-American political scientist Peter Katzenstein, who is, I think, one of the most influential writers on German politics, actually, of the last 50, 60 years. His book from 1987, Politics and Policy in Germany, West Germany, The Growth of the Semi-Sovereign State, is still, I think, enormously relevant. It's a fantastic read, if you like that kind of thing. But one of the things that what Katzenstein pointed out in his very, very sophisticated analysis is that in Germany you have a kind of a juxtaposition between, on the one hand, a very decentralized state with federalism, with government coalitions, with a very strong constitutional court. Interestingly, also a weak chancellor, something which is sometimes, I think, forgotten when people think about German chancellors who tend to be quite long-lived. And when people think of Angela Merkel, she was imbued with this idea of having an enormous power. Actually, constitutionally, her position was quite weak compared, let's say, to a British prime minister. And then para-public institutions which had key parts of public policy devolved to them, All of these then, of course, being geographically distributed. So it's not that everything is in Berlin, it's actually there are multiple geographic centres in Germany. And all of that is deliberate so that to stop a reoccurrence of National Socialism. But then that decentralised state was balanced by really quite strong societal organisations who were all crucially often insider organisations. They were required for the implementation of policy. So they had a really important role in German politics. The unions, but also professional bodies, doctors, for instance, is a really good example of that. Germany also had what's called a militant democracy. The state gave itself the right to defend itself against anti-democratic organisations. There's two examples of parties who were banned by the Constitutional Court. Firstly, an extreme right-wing party, the SRP, and then later the KPD in 1956, the Communist Party. Now, the interesting thing here, and this is all important later on, as we'll come to talk about, the KPD is a classic example of Monty Python approaches to what happens in these kind of cases, because the KPD basically predated the idea of the People's Front of Judea and the Judean People's Front, because the KPD simply became the DKP and then continued to exist. What's perils of banning political parties. We see the party system rapidly concentrating around two large so-called Volksparteien, catch-all parties which cut across traditional social cleavages. This was a model developed by Otto Kirchheimer, and then that very high normative value on consensus, again, that politics of centrality, as Gordon Smith described it. You have all of that, and then you have that real focus on reconciliation with former enemies, notably France, and a really popular commitment to pacifism. All of these will come up as we go through the lecture. So here, just to show you, to give some of these really powerful images, Willy Brandt in 1970 at the memorial of the Warsaw Uprising, the Kniefall, where he spontaneously fell to his knees, very powerful symbol of reconciliation. And then likewise, back in 1984 with François Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl at the site of the Battle of Verdun. These were really important moments in West German history to demonstrate that reconciliation of West Germany. And here you then see the federal election results from between 49 and 87. And you can see here quite nicely, if you look at the purple line, which goes down here, that's the others, and you see how that declines very quickly to a juncture where basically between 1961 and 1983, you just have three parties in Parliament: but the central right, Christian Democrats; the centre left, Social Democrats; and the Free Democrats, the Liberal Party. But here already, look there at the bottom right, you see that little green line going upwards. Those are the Greens, and that's a foreshadowing of what was to come, what will be coming after unification. So beyond that, beyond those kind of constitutional arrangements, you have then a very strong economy. You have in Germany a relatively undervalued currency, which was set up after the currency reform of 1948. Within a fixed exchange rate system, of course, triggers a situation where German exports were really quite cheap. And that, of course, is the foundation of a strong economic growth in the 1950s and 1960s, the so-called Wirtschaftswunder. We also see, though, history, again, that important, the scars of hyperinflation, the hyperinflation which bedeviled the Weimar Republic in 1922 and 23. This accounts for the fact that monetary policy was devolved to the Bundesbank. So interest rate setting has never been a political issue under the Federal Republic of Germany. And of course, that is now a model which is spread elsewhere, notably the ECB, but actually also to the Bank of England. This has been an extraordinarily successful model of how you manage monetary policy. And then that aversion to inflation and inversion to debt, because debt ultimately, of course, is a cause of inflation, both public and private. Now, this strong economic performance very clearly legitimizes West German democracy. This was clearly established in a book by Orman and Werber in 1959 called The Civic Culture. Again, really important and influential study which compared the political culture of five democracies and West Germany. That was their key kind of takeaway from this, that actually it was the economy which helped to make German democracy legitimized. And that's then gives that rise to what we now know as Modell Deutschland, with strong labour relations, high labour productivity, very effective vocational training, very generous social benefits, but also high barriers to market entry and a quite kind of introspective system of financing, of corporate financing, relying largely on banks. But that, of course, comes to an end as in most countries in the early 1970s. And if you look here at real GDP growth in West Germany between 1951 and 1990, you can see, first of all, those very, very strong years of growth between 8 and 10%. Between 1951 and right up to the end of the 1960s and early 1970s. You can see, if you look there in 1973 and 74, that's the oil shock, and that's the end of Bretton Woods, and you can see then that long-term downward trajectory. So that's been a challenge for the German economy, and like all Western European economies, which it's not really recovered from. And the last thing I want to, in terms of that foundations of democracy, is that embedded foreign and in EU policy, and that's traditionally seen as a kind of having a dual focus. On the one hand, on European integration, as it's had two pillars: that European integration, but also the transatlantic relationship. And Germany deliberately aligned itself very strongly with the United States, not just because it was an occupying power, but it was, of course, the predominant figure in the Western world, and therefore West Germany always made sure that it followed very closely American political priorities, with an obvious exception being Ostpolitik in the early 1970s. That's really one of the only examples where West Germany took a different line to what the American government wanted at the time. Priority of rehabilitation, of course, also with both the Soviet Union and Israel. Again, you can see where this one is going to go in the current situation, but that was absolutely very, very important for West Germany, and not least because actually there were German prisoners of war in the Soviet Union until 1955. So it's a long time after the end of the war that the last prisoners of war were actually released by the Soviet Union. Security-wise, Germany maintained very large armed forces during the Cold War, but there was no deployment outside of Germany. There was no independent nuclear capability, and there was conscription as a way of anchoring the army within society, so that you wouldn't have a kind of separate military class. And this is why people like Hans Maul described Germany as an archetypal civilian power with a focus on development aid, cultural organizations, and the party foundations who actually act internationally. So that semi-sovereignty that I mentioned about internally, that in many ways applies externally as well, because remember, also up to 1990, actually the Western Allies retained residual sovereignty powers over, for instance, West Berlin. Yeah, that's right. So let's go on to this one. So how then has Germany changed after unification? Well, let's look at this then a bit more detail in terms of starting off with the economy. And firstly, of course, noting that there have been very significant economic challenges of unification. Germany has spent vast amounts of money on Eastern Germany, in excess of 2 trillion euros. That's the net value. This is not just the gross value. It's once you actually take into account the transfers back. So it's an enormous amount of money that has been spent on Germany. Initially, really, actually largely financed through debt. You can see that very clearly in the public finances of the German government, that actually in that initial period, that was financed through debt. But it hasn't actually necessarily managed to deliver much of consistency in economic performance in Eastern Germany. Eastern Germany remains largely bedeviled by lower productivity, lower wages, and higher unemployment than it does in the western part of the country. And that's also one of the reasons why the population has been dropping in Eastern Germany. It's quite interesting. In the GDR, it's actually up to almost 18 million, and it was already declining as a result of people leaving. But since 1990, it's declined from 15 million down to 12.6 million. What that, of course, means is that you now have quite large parts of places like Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, which are fairly depopulated, there really isn't anybody left. There's some large parts where in the past you would have had schools and churches and shops. They're just not there anymore. And that is quite an interesting factor, just to see how that, again, that will have probably some implications for how, for instance, Eastern Germany votes now. Lastly, but then beyond that, we've seen actually that there's, of course, globalization has also factored into this, and globalization has created challenges for Germany, as it has for many other countries. It challenges the whole basis of Modell Deutschland, which was largely a fairly kind of inward-looking and quite kind of introspective way of organising an economy. But then we also, of course, see that once globalisation does come out, that you start to see some of the less appealing parts of Modell Deutschland becoming apparent, and that's notably a fairly cosy and sometimes corrupt relationship, effectively even, between government and key industrial companies who were just seen as too important to fail. And the Dieselgate scandal is a really obvious example of that. But also Wirecard, if you remember this one, where very clearly the German government just did not want the Financial Times to actually investigate what Wirecard, which was seen as one of the biggest companies of the new economy, was actually doing. Digitalization is a really interesting one, and actually that use of big data, all that thing, what we are talking about quite a lot, and then because in Britain and elsewhere, something which sits really uncomfortably with Germany, because of course data protection and state surveillance. Germany has had bad experience with state surveillance, after all, because two of the most effective regimes of state surveillance, in terms of firstly National Socialist Germany and secondly the GDR, were on its territory. And so Germans are really quite instinctively cautious about the use of big data, the use of personal data in a way which Britain, for instance, I mean, compare the use of cameras in Germany compared to Britain. Cameras are everywhere here, they're not in Germany. Compare the use of electronic payment mechanisms in Germany. It's still quite hard. You go to plenty of shops where they just don't accept any kind of electronic, they want cash. And that I think harks back to these kind of longer term historical echoes. We have the Eurozone crisis, which of course, again, picks up on those historical fears about debt, and that then leads to the debt brake, which Germany introduced for its own public finances from 2016, which has been really quite problematic overall. Fukushima in 2011, the Japanese nuclear power plant, which was a big accident at the time, that prompted a commitment from Germany to exit from nuclear power and to switch its energy provision, to Russian gas. Well, what possibly could go wrong with that? And overall, what I think is fascinating is that Germany still remains really quite reliant on exports of high-value manufactured goods, in the sense of like cars and machine goods in particular. That's really quite unusual now compared to other advanced economies who are much more reliant on service provision. The service sector in Germany remains pretty underdeveloped. And if we now look at that picture of real GDP growth between 1990 and 2024, you will see just actually how difficult that has been. Actually, if you look at the number of years here where growth is higher than 2%, it's a third. It's just a third. So over time, what actually the German economy has really kind of struggled to get going. Of course, there are big recessions here with the financial recession, actually the global financial crisis, and COVID. Actually, interestingly, the global financial crisis was a bigger recession for Germany than COVID. And here you see the picture of public sector debt. Now, these levels of public sector debt in an international comparison are particularly high. If you compare that with Belgium or with Greece or with Italy, actually 60% or 80% is relatively modest. But again, because Germany has a cultural aversion to debt, this kind of thing really mattered. And particularly if you look, I've marked up here the 60% Maastricht criterion for membership of the euro, and actually Germany only managed to meet that, in other words, being below that, in 2 years. 2 years over the last 30. It was above, not by much, yeah, but it was above that in all the rest of the years. So you can see that for Germany, particularly think about the Eurozone crisis, where Germany was basically, perhaps not necessarily wisely, saying to Greece, you need to get your house in order, wagging finger. Actually, of course, Greek government might well say, but look at your own levels of debt, because they're actually quite high. And that's one of the reasons why actually there was a debt brake, which came into effect in 2016 and led to a reduction of debt back down below that 60% line before going back up because of COVID. What about post-unification politics? Well, interestingly, unification actually was it should have been, the idea of the basic law was actually that once unification happens, you get rid of the basic law and have a whole new thing. You basically rip it up and start again. But in fact, that didn't happen. In the end, what actually happened is that East Germany joined West Germany, the existing constitutional settlement, which was almost by the back door. That was possible, it was legal, but it wasn't actually the original intention of the law. So what it's basically meant is that the existing constitutional arrangement was just extended from West Germany to East Germany. But it's come under tension as a result of that, because what we've already talked about, that the economic situation in Eastern Germany, which is actually a bit broader than that. You see this, and actually, and it's quite interesting, and a whole range of different things about practices, not just about economics. We'll talk about voting in a minute, but it's actually also about some of the cultural practices. Childcare is a really, really good example, which in the GDR was ubiquitous, it was free, and so actually lots of children go into childcare in Eastern Germany from a very low age, and the coverage is very good. Not so in Western Germany, where culturally, because of a kind of Catholic morality, which was very common, and it was still kind of quite prevalent in Western Germany, there's much lower levels of that. So there is definitely a quite long shadow of the GDR in Eastern Germany. But we also, because we have those now more federal states, now 16 as opposed to 11, we see a much greater, quite obviously a greater diversity of political interests. Also political parties becoming more diverse, and that therefore means that actually it becomes harder to gain consensus, to build a kind of consistent line which reaches across those societal cleavages in the same way that the Volksparteien were able to before 1990. So this, in a way, again, is not that unusual. Most countries have this kind of fragmentation of their party systems and that increased volatility. But in Germany's case, this adds an extra layer of complexity. Interestingly, though, voter turnout has generally fallen. It is still quite high, and actually it's been rising again in 2025. The last election in February actually had a turnout of 82.5%. Now compare that to where we are in Britain, never mind the United States, and you can see how much higher that is. That's also important in terms of changing what that means for the political incentives to actually change things in Germany, because the thing is, in Germany, people vote, and crucially, compared to the United States, people who are less people who have a less socioeconomic status vote, which is not the case in the United States. So if I now show you this picture of the election results in Germany between 1990 and 2025, what you can see here is a much more complex picture. I mean, you can see it just, there's more colours and they're going up and down quite a bit more. And that already gives you that sense of that the fragmentation of the German party system is quite visualised in this. You can see how the CDU is kind of stays steady, but then really kind of starts to drop after 2013. The SPD has been on a long-term decline, and then of course here, that blue line at the end, that one which is going up to the third highest, that's the AfD. And that's then, of course, is going to be the big game changer. But actually, you see also that you've got the Left Party, which is a former Communist Party in East Germany. You've got the Greens, which we already talked about, the SP and the FDP, all still vying around, all still part of that picture as well. So we've got a much greater number of parties now represented in the German Parliament than previously. So what does that mean, and how's that then manifested itself, that post-unification picture, in foreign defence policy? Well, here we've been talking that's been quite an important change. We've talked about the normalisation of Germany's European policy particularly post 1998, once the change of government from Helmut Kohl. Germany became what Simon Bullman and Willie Patterson have described as a reluctant hegemon, a quite powerful player in the European Union, but a country which was reluctant to actually exercise that power. So that normalization piece is really about saying that Germany actually started to focus a bit more on its own domestic interests, rather than thinking about European integration as a good on its own terms. That's why we've referred to it as normalization. I think what's interesting here, though, is that it also reflects the way that the EU has changed, because of course the EU has not just grown since 1998. There's more member states now, but of course its operation has changed. It has focused much more on the single market. It's correct that there's new pillars, there's new areas of activity. So within that greater complexity that we see in the European Union, it is of course not surprising that individual member states actually start to be a bit more focused on their own domestic interests. But there is a really interesting question there, because this comes up with the Constitutional Court actually quite frequently. How much into EU integration is actually compatible with the German constitution? How much power is it okay to give away to Europe as a nation, as German nation state? And the German Constitutional Court has set some limits in this regard, which ultimately haven't been reached yet, but which will ultimately challenge future German EU policy. And linked to that normalisation, we get to the tension between solidarity and national interest. And these are really nice examples. It's solidarity on where you think about we should all be European together, and actually let's focus on our hard-nosed national interest. And of course, in the Eurozone crisis, Germany took a line of saying, oh, we don't want to be paying, we don't want to have Euro bonds, we don't want to be having harmonised debt provisions for all other countries. But in the Syrian refugee crisis, Germany would have probably quite liked actually some other countries, notably from Eastern Europe, to take a few more of the Syrian refugees rather than the more coming, the vast majority coming to Germany, which of course they did. So you can see a tension in that regard too. When you look at defence, we see a quite interesting, interesting trend. So firstly, of course, defence expenditure, the peace dividend is clearly there. Germany cashes in that peace dividend hard, going from a position where it was spending about 3% of GDP on defence down to barely over 1%. The size of the army shrinks to about 185,000, so barely 40% of its previous levels. Conscription is suspended and equipment levels are driven down. So that puts a kind of quite interesting perspective on where Germany is now, and again, is the context of some of the debates that we're seeing beyond that. The fact that though that some of the core tenets about overseas deployments don't change means that Germany remains that consumer of the hard security ultimately provided by others within NATO, and particularly, of course, the United States, which is again one of the reasons why Donald Trump has not been the first president to criticize Germany for its lack of defense expenditure. That's been going on for quite some time as well. Now, the big change, of course, is 2022, when Russia invades Ukraine. And this then prompts what's called the Zeitenwende, the change in the times, and a promise to higher levels of defence expenditure. However, it's not happened yet, and there's quite a lot of ground to make up, and in terms of the quality of the German armed forces and the equipment levels. And of course, if you're going to spend more money, as we're finding in the UK as well, if you want to spend more money on military, you're going to have to take it from somewhere else. And where is that going to be? And that's going to be quite a difficult discussion. But beyond that, and I think this is again is that last point here is important to understanding Germany, because it's not, the support for Ukraine is not unanimous. There are real voices in Germany who are very skeptical of Germany's Zeitenwende for lots of different reasons. Some think actually we'd like to carry on having the cheap gas. Some thinks that Germany should not be have a military presence in any case because of its history, that pacifism. That the whole historical element of that, which feeds into that as well. But there's also some real genuine sympathy for Russia. Again, it's very interesting that the two parties who are most pro-Russian are the extreme left, BSW, former communists, and the extreme right, AfD. Both have a very close affinity to Russia. So let me then come on to three structural challenges which I think are going to face and shape Germany as it goes forward over the next 20, 30 years. And the first one of these, again, no great surprise here, is demographics, which is going to shape an issue in most European countries, but actually Germany, I think, probably not quite as hard as the Baltics or Southern Europe, but certainly more than France or Britain. So like most European countries, Germany does face those quite strong changes in that and population size, because the fertility rates in Germany at roughly 1.4, maybe 1.5, sometimes 1.3, it doesn't really matter. It's at this level, it's just low. It's been there like that since the early 1970s. So that's a long time now. That's 50 years of fertility rates which have been below the replacement level. So unsurprisingly, this does have an impact on the shape of your population pyramid. And it does mean that potentially the population could yet fall to about 75 million by 2070. At that level, it would be only marginally bigger than France's population, which is itself interesting if you think about what that might mean for the balance of power within the European Union. If suddenly France becomes the biggest population country by population in the European Union. And all of these changes, that change and balance between different age groups, all of that, of course, creates quite significant challenges for the welfare state. And again, this isn't unusual. We are certainly facing similar problems in the United Kingdom as well, and other countries too. But I think in Germany's case, it's because of that longevity of it, and also because immigration, and we'll come on to that in a minute as well, has been actually fluctuating quite a lot over time. It makes it very difficult to see actually, is there going to be a way out of this for Germany? And actually, the welfare provision, by the way, for parenthood in Germany is very, very generous, much more generous to here, because as we know, there isn't actually a direct correlation between the level of welfare benefits for parents and actually the birth rate. These two things are not, or perhaps only partially. You know, Colette's a sociologist, so she knows about these things. I should shut up, really, shouldn't I, about that? Okay, so I've got this, which I love this chart because it's history in action. This is the age pyramid that you have in Germany. And you can see, obviously, on the left, the one on the outside left is 1910, 1950, then below 2021 and 2070. So looking ahead, and I just think it's fantastic because you see history in action. If you look at the one from 1950, you can see on that, I've marked it out here for your convenience, where there are more women than men in the population because of male casualties in firstly the First World War and then secondly in the Second World War. You can identify 1918 really easily, not a great year to have kids, nor was 1945, but then you can also see in that area of the area between 10 and 20s, that's the increase of births under National Socialism, and that because the National Socialists obviously had a very pro-birth policy in Germany, and that of course shapes then that shape of the population pyramid which we see in 2021. But you can see how we start to get, if you compare 1910 to 2021, how we're already heading to an inversion of the age pyramid. That's going to be the challenge in Germany. And we know it's going to happen. We know it's going to happen because, after all, the people who are going to be in 2070, the people who are going to be who are going to be 50 in 2070 are already alive. They're 5 now. So we do know this is going to happen. It just depends on to what level, and this comes down to the question of net migration. And this again is very interesting. Compare it to the United Kingdom. If this is the kind of tracking net migration over the long period since 1990 to Germany, and you can see some quite big fluctuations. I mean, actually, in 2008, 2009, you actually get negative net migration, linked again to the global financial crisis. But the idea that there is a consistency to this is just not there. So depending on actually what happens to this, that will determine ultimately the size and the structure of Germany's population in the future. But also just interesting, of course, to compare the absolute levels here, and particularly in 2015, the refugees from the Syrian war, it's 1.2 million. Compare that with our net migration levels in the United Kingdom. Now, Germany's a bigger country, obviously, it's a higher population, but it's quite different, really. I always think it's, when we talk about net migration levels, it's useful to have that kind of context in there. Second structural challenge then is a fiscal challenge, because actually that itself is going to be very difficult for the future. All the challenges we've talked about, the economy, the welfare demands, the low productivity in the East, the demographics, they're all going to basically come together into a fiscal challenge. And the debt brake, which is still in force, has become quite a dogma, but it's really, really hard because, of course, having a debt brake, the idea that you don't actually have any new public debt, is great in principle, but it's not so good if you have a proper downturn. Yeah, that becomes then really, really hard to maintain, and Germany has found that. And what it's basically meant is that public investment in Germany has been cut back very, very significantly. And you see that in transport. digital infrastructure. Try using a mobile phone on a German train. Oh my God, you think Avanti is bad? Yeah, try the Deutsche Bahn on this. Yeah, try. How it's amazing to see how many processes in Germany still rely on paper. If anybody here has ever tried to apply, and I bear the scars of this, colleagues, of applying for a German passport. It's all on paper. That's the way it works. They're literally boxes and boxes of paper applications. And that is the way that large sections of German public administration still work. It's very, very slow to actually going to a digitalized public service. So all of that, of course, then creates a vicious circle, effectively, of lower levels of wage growth, leaving high, combined with high saving rates, affecting domestic consumption, which has typically been quite low in Germany, and then lower economic growth, which leads to lower tax receipts. And you see how all of this works. So that's why we see that squeeze in public finances. But interestingly enough, Germany spends quite a lot. The government share of expenditure is quite high compared to Britain, but not compared to the EU. So we are roughly 43% of GDP. In Germany, it's just under 50%. That's kind of mid-range for the EU, where the big countries like France and Finland are more like 60%. Again, useful bit of context for us always to bear in mind when we have discussions about how much we actually pay in tax in the United Kingdom, because compared to actually other European countries, we don't. The debt brake does ultimately contribute to the collapse of the last government, which the government which has just finished, the SPD FDP Green government. And now we've got investment sitting out, defence sitting outside its framework. So there is some creative bits of thinking going on, whereby you just sort of say, yeah, well, we'll have a debt brake, but this bit won't count, and that's which is of course one way of doing it. But the key thing for me is that those last 2 points. The political incentives for reform in Germany are very low, because pensioners, like elsewhere, are the largest group of voters. They are growing and they turn out. So if you're a political party, you're going to do that. You're going to follow what actually pensioners want, because they're the ones who are going to ensure that you actually get into office. Unfortunately, and again, this is a common picture across Europe, younger people do not tend to turn out in the same to the same degree, and therefore, of course, kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that therefore their interests will not be taken into consideration the same way by political parties, but also that the number of people who live off the welfare payment state now exceeds those paying into it. As soon as you have that kind of dynamic, you can see why, particularly as those people do vote, there's going to be very little incentive to change that. And again, you see that that's a really interesting example after back in 2005 at the election. Then the CDU, this Angela Merkel's first election that she won, they really went in with a kind of quite right-wing, Thatcherite almost manifesto. The voters didn't like it, and after that she swung straight back to the centre and basically had a fairly tepid kind of centrist form of policy, neither one thing or the other, to be perfectly honest. And I think that's one of the reasons why the CDU actually has been a bit of problem. They lost their identity as a result of that. That's not a political statement. It's just kind of, having spent some time looking at German Christian democracy, it's so interesting how much of this their current woes go back to that 2005 election, which they never really actually understood and spend time thinking about. And that then comes to that the third element of that challenge, which is party politics, because we now effectively in Germany have two quite distinct party systems in the West and East. We have pariah parties in the form of the Left Party and the BSW, both of whom are variants of the former East German communists, and the AfD, and that makes coalition governments just very difficult to construct. And that's why we get relatively unusual combinations like the Social Democrats, the Liberals, and the Greens. It's not an obvious combination. It's worked at state level, but at national level, it really didn't work. And I think it's going to be a while before we get that again. Then we've got the AfD, and I do want to just sort of talk briefly about the AfD, because the AfD is the big party which, of course, has grown. And it's grown by shifting to the right on immigration. It started off as a fairly conventional, conservative, not even anti-European. It was a kind of mild Eurosceptic party, but then it discovered immigration, and particularly as a result of the 2015 Syrian refugee crisis, shifted to the right, and its fortunes just took off. And now, interestingly, this party has been officially designated as extreme right wing by the Domestic Intelligence Service. So that's quite a bits of it were, but now actually the whole thing has been designated as extreme right wing. So what does that mean? How do you deal with this? And it's really interesting because talking to German politicians, and I've asked them this, I said, how do you deal with the AfD? And they don't know, is the truth. It's one of the fundamental challenges for populist parties. How do you deal with a party which doesn't play by the rules? And the AfD is very interesting. In Parliament, it doesn't play by the rules of democratic convention. It's not quiet when other people speak. They're constantly chattering, they constantly interject, and they just don't behave in the way that normal political parties, democratic political parties, including, the Greens were long seen as being terribly radical because they decided not to wear a tie in the Bundestag. In my word, certainly wouldn't see me in that position, but they were seen as very radical from that perspective. And yet, of course, they weren't, because they still ultimately believed in the democratic norms. The AfD does not. And how do you deal with that? It's a really, really difficult question, which certainly German politicians do not have an answer to. And I think we struggle across Europe with that. So they basically have three options. There's principally for the CDU, CSU, because they're closest next to them. Do you engage the AfD in decision making? For instance, starting at local level, but they're actually having coalitions with them. Do you ostracize it in Parliament, which is, for instance, what's happened now? It's the second largest party in the Parliament, yet it has no select committee chairs. Is that good for democracy? I don't know, but it's a question. I think it's a legitimate question to be asking. Or do you actually push for it to have a formal ban by the Constitutional Court, as we saw back in the 1950s with the extreme right party and the communists? Well, clearly, there is no easy answer to this. Each of these is fraught with risks and dangers, and none of them is guaranteed success. It is a real, real problem for Germany. If I had to identify, therefore, a challenge to German democracy, a really serious challenge to me, it would be the AfD, actually, because they don't play by the same rules. And that, I think, is fundamentally what we will see with many other populist parties in Europe today. Now, I just want to show you this. This is a map which was quite popular after the last election, which looks at a kind of graphic visualization of where parties were strongest after the election. And you can see this is, again, it's an interesting split you see between West and East. The West is largely black, that's the CDU, with some little pockets of green, which are the Greens, the bits of red, which are the Social Democrats. So you can see that's fairly kind of a consistent pattern. But then the East is that blue, which is the AfD. So there's a really kind of nice, so simple. I think this is a bit too simplistic, to be perfectly honest. But this was quite a popular chart after the last election, showing that kind of clear split between West and East. Actually, I think this one is more helpful, because if we really look then at actually how the parties performed in the West and East, you can see a quite big difference here. So actually, the AfD ends up, massively the most popular party in the East with over almost 35% of the vote. But actually, it's also still the second largest party in the West. Even then, it's the second largest. It beat the SPD in the West. You see big challenges that parties really struggle to get that kind of, actually all the parties, including the AfD, including the extreme, the BSW and the Left Party, struggle to get that balance of that equivalence of vote between the West and the East. You can really see how those two separate party systems are manifesting themselves. They look completely different, and crucially, that in Eastern Germany, those parties of the left and the right fringes account for half of the vote, and in the West, the parties of the centre account for 2/3 of the vote. That's the really thing which I think is most telling about the 2025 election result. Okay, so this brings me then to my conclusion on this and the three themes which we see in contemporary German politics. So firstly, the themes are that shadow of the past, that rehabilitation, reconciliation. We see that in the structure of the political system, the commitment to European integration, the importance of pacifism, the role of the armed forces, that idea of reflexive multilateralism in foreign policy that Germany would rarely, even today, go and actually do things by itself and always work with partners through a multilateral approach. The importance of consensus, that what we have so far had is a broadly centripetal party system. It is interesting. I think one of the big questions will be to what extent we're actually moving towards a more centrifugal party system, which of course we had in the latter days of the Weimar Republic. I don't think we're there yet, but actually I suspect the next election in 2029 will be quite an important one in this regard. A skewing of outright majoritarian politics and that significant long-term continuity in policy. That is undoubtedly something that you see. You don't have that kind of pattern that you see elsewhere where new government comes in and they change everything. There is big continuity, not least because of coalition government in Germany between governments. But then we see the pressures about transformation through unification, through the globalized economy, through demographics, the challenges around welfare, the voting patterns, and of course also that the role of Germany in the wider world. And again, pick this up. Obviously, Russia is important in this regard, but so is Israel. And Germany has found itself in a very difficult position over Gaza, as you can imagine, given its historical legacy, and it's not always managed to find it easy to navigate. And of course, now interesting, the question will be to what extent the United States is going to be in that category. The fact that you have the Secretary of State actually criticizing the German Domestic Security Service for designating the AfD as extreme right wing, which he did, that's quite telling. I mean, that's not normal. You haven't seen that in the past, and it does create then a position for the German government of thinking, what's this going to mean for the future? By the way, Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor, is heading to Washington day after tomorrow. So wish him good luck for that. So, in case you would like to know more, I've drawn here on some of the books which I've been privileged enough to write on, co-author and edit over the years. And this is so some of the ideas today have really kind of drawn on this oeuvre over a long period of time. And that broadly brings me to the end, except I do just want to take a moment at the end to actually thank and recognise a number of people, because after all, in any academic career, it's never about the individual. It's all about the people who support you, the people who you've learned from, and the people who you work with. And if I think, and I've been very fortunate to work with some fantastic, to learn from some of the best scholars, some of whom I've referenced here, obviously Willie Patterson, Charlie Jeffrey, but then people like Manfred Schmidt, who I was fortunate to be taught by in Heidelberg. He absolutely wonderful scholar in this area, and Peter Katzenstein, who also I worked with on the book Governance in Contemporary Germany, which actually featured a conclusion by him, which was a great privilege. A really great scholar to work with. But then, of course, also the scholars who I've been privileged to work with together. That includes, and I think one of them's on the line call today, Charlie. My colleague and close friend Charlie Lees, the people who I've worked with on the Politics of the New Germany, which is the textbook. That was great fun to do, but it really was very, very hard. And also, of course, my PhD students. And I've been, again, hugely privileged to have some outstanding PhD students, many of whom are in academia today. And that's been one of the great joys of being an academic life, is actually to have the PhD students, as we all know, who then go on to do fantastic things in their disciplines themselves. But last, but by no means least, it is, of course, my family, because the family are the ones who provide you with, and all of us, with that shall we say, reality check in terms of what's going on. My wife who's again, I think is on the call too, is also an academic. So one of the kind of the downsides of this is whenever I say, look, darling, I really need to go to this really glamorous conference, which is halfway across the world, and would you be right to look after the kids for the next week and a half? She, of course, will say, you must be having a laugh. And she'd be right to do so. So none of this cuts any ice with her. But no, I've been very fortunate to have that grounding and that privilege of my family, who have been hugely supportive, and I'm enormously indebted to them all. And that, I think, brings us a bit too close, but there we go. Sorry about that. You were going to give me an indication when we were close to half past, but anyway, okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. This was an absolutely amazing lecture, if I may call it that. and it gave us great insight in everything you've been doing in the last decade. So thank you so much for that, and fascinating to learn about Germany, old and new. There's only a little time for questions because we went over just a bit. So I've been given permission for 2, but I may go slightly over depending on how many hands go up. I have 3 here on paper. There's one that I absolutely want to read to you because it's one that I had too. So if I can start with that, and then people in the audience can think about whether they want to raise their hand as well. I'm seeing one in the back already. So this one question from someone online is, how does the AfD compare with other populist parties in Europe?
Yeah. So without going into too much detail, I think the really interesting thing is that most populist parties in Europe have actually become more electorally appealing by moderating their position. You see that, look at the Rassemblement National in France. That's a classic, the Marine Le Pen. The AfD is different because it's actually got more greater electoral appeal by becoming harder. It's gone harder to the right and become more nationalist, and that's not a normal kind of situation. I think that's a really interesting. I'm not a scholar of the AfD. I know that other people would have an explanation for that, but I think that's a really interesting juxtaposition.
It is. Thank you. Great answer. I saw a hand. Yeah, up there. Please go ahead.
Thank you for the lecture. Very interesting. So I'm David Mark, Politics and Contemporary History. So just a question. So obviously a lot of Europe now is realigning itself with the defence, greater defence spending given 2002. Do you think that there will be a remilitarisation of German society? It still feels to me that as a percent of GDP, even the high pledge of spending is still low, comparatively low. So firstly, do you think there is going to be remilitarisation of German society? And if there is, do you think there's any threats to German democracy? We've already seen, for example, AfD involved, and do you think it might weaken the AfD might actually involved?
So I think there's clearly got to be a different approach to defence in Germany. It's certainly there's already discussion about whether conscription needs to be reintroduced. We can have a debate about whether conscription is an effective way of boosting your military capacities, but that is undoubtedly a debate which is going on. The German armed forces have, of course, had some issues themselves with right-wing extremism, and there's been some quite notable cases where actually there's been a culture of fairly right-wing, I hesitate to use the term neo-Nazi, but you know what I mean, activity going on. So does it mean that there will be a remilitarization? I think it would be hard to see how kind of Prussia, in that sense, with it was very heavily militarized society, would come back. But I think ultimately Germany is facing the same challenges as all European countries in this regard. And you saw the German chief of the defense staff making the point that actually, potentially Germany needs to be ready for actual military action and an invasion in 4 years. And Germany's always been quite clear and very conscious, just like Poland has, that if there really were a Russian invasion of Europe, then actually it would be affected quite quickly by it through its geography.
I'm going to read one more question from the online audience, and then I think we need to draw this to a close, but there's plenty of time during drinks to ask them many questions I'm sure you all still have. This one is, what is the impact of generational change on the perception of National Socialism in Germany?
Yeah, a really interesting one, isn't it? So, of course, the war generation, the people who experienced National Socialism directly, is now almost gone. There are hardly anybody left who can still really remember what National Socialism was like, and so you inevitably get a slightly kind of jaundiced and almost romanticization of that period. Again, it will happen in other countries in different contexts as well. But of course, I think that's one of the big questions to see. The memory culture in Germany is very different to other countries. Germany's been quite kind of upfront about its guilt in terms of particularly the Holocaust. And you can just see that by the fact that in central Berlin, in one of the best bits of prime real estate, you have the Holocaust Memorial, which is very, very impressive if you go to it, or the fact that you know all of the former camps you can visit them and actually are very moving museums to this. So, but how that will change, I think, I suspect it won't change very quickly, but in 50, 60 years, when this really kind of turns into past history, that will be a different question.
Thank you, Simon. I'm really sorry we have to stop.
No, I'm
this
sorry for
fascinating
going on for
discussion.
too long.
Don't worry, it was just absolutely wonderful. And incidentally, the Dutch right-wing government just imploded today after 11 months because the ultra right-wing party just clearly didn't understand, or didn't, well, they probably understand, but couldn't be part of a properly run government. So I think there's still hope. We'll see how it all evolves in the next decades. So thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. And I'm now going to invite all of you to come with us to the place where you came in, where we'll have drinks and some nibbles, I think. I also want to thank the online audience for being here, your family, and everybody who's very interested in your career and your work. So thank you for joining us here in Salford today. And then, of course, thanks to all the colleagues who came here tonight to wish you a happy journey here at the university. And we're hoping you're going to stay with us for a long time and do some of your best work here in Salford. Thanks a lot.
And can I also add thanks to the organising team who've done a fantastic job in putting it tonight.
I'm going to hand you a present. I'm going to put down my microphone because I really don't want to drop it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.